It seems like we get some sort of Namco game collection every other year at this point. People are always joking about how many times Sonic 1 has been ported, but I think the OG Pac-Man has it beat. This time's 100th port of Pac-Man comes to us in the flavor of Pac-Man Museum Plus, which, as the name would suggest, is solely focused on Pac-Man titles opposed to Namco's other outings. And if you're wondering where that plus is coming from, there was a lesser discussed game in 2014 just called Pac-Man Museum. Same idea as this, except less games, and based on that terrible Pac-Man TV show that premiered around the same time. I think we all wish we forgot about that one. With Pac-Man Museum Plus, you're getting 14 games in total, all presented in a virtual arcade that is totally customizable. The selection is mostly good, and that price tag of $20 might be the most appealing thing about the collection. Well, $20 for every version that isn't the Switch's physical version. Yeah, this game is on PS4, Xbone, and Switch, is $20 on every console regardless if you're going physical or digital, except for the Switch's physical version, which is $30 because Switch tax. Regardless, as appealing as that $20 price tag may sound, it's not as straightforward as you would hope. There's a lot of things that set this collection back that are worth knowing about before making that purchase. Before I get into those setbacks, let's do a quick overview of what you're getting in this collection. So you got the OG Pac-Man, of course, which I personally think has stood the test of time. And if you're watching this, odds are you believe that as well. I mean, for a game that is over 40 years old, it's impressive how fun and accessible the original Pac-Man still is. I'm gonna be bold here, but there is no other video game as old as Pac-Man that is anywhere near as good as Pac-Man. Of course, in the following years, we saw stuff like Galaga, Super Mario, and Tetris, but Pac-Man precedes all of those. Alongside Pac-Man, we also get its niche siblings, Super Pac-Man and Pac-and-Pal, which offers slight deviations on the formula. Super Pac-Man lets you grow huge, allowing you to eat gates and pass through ghosts, and Pal has this little butthole that will try to steal your fruit. Pac-and-Pal doesn't have any power pellets, which means no eating ghost. Instead, all you can do is shoot out a ranged attack that can stun them. The attacks themselves are based off other Namco properties like Galaga and Rally X, which is neat, but eating other ghosts is infinitely more satisfying. Both games are fine, but I think I prefer the original Pac-Man. Then there's Pac-Land, an early 1984 platformer that precedes Super Mario, although it's probably best known these days as a shitty Smash Bros. Stage. The game is better than the stage, I promise. Pac-Mania is a more advanced version of Pac-Man, complete with a jump button allowing you to pass over the ghost. People will refer to the art style in the game as isometric, but those people are liars. This perspective used is actually called Cavalier, and you can remember that because it's impossible to not sound like a jackass when you say it. Next time someone tells you this is an isometric game, you give them a big ol' kiss. I mean, you tell them they're wrong. Pac-Attack is a Tetris-style game where you clear lines and drop a Pac-Man to eat ghosts on the board. The version used in this collection is the Super Nintendo version, which I think was a questionable decision given the PS1 version exists, and is better on all accounts. There's Pac-in-Time, which is easily the strangest inclusion in this collection, and that's saying a lot because there's some weird stuff we haven't even got to yet. This is a very mediocre platformer originally for the Super Nintendo. It's not terrible or anything, but it's super repetitive. This is a subgenre of platformers that has thankfully died out in recent years. I don't know what you'd call it, but it's one of those games where you're like stuck in a small labyrinthian stage where your goal is to get every item on the map. Then once you do that, you move on to the next level and the whole cycle continues. On paper, that description is kind of Pac-Man sounding, but trust me, it's nothing like Pac-Man. It's more similar to like that home improvement game. It's not even a joke, that's honestly what I would compare it to. Other versions of this game just had you get to the end of each stage, which I think is much more enjoyable. Your mileage might vary though. We get both versions of Pac-Man Arrangement. The first was found in Namco Collection arcade cabinets back in '96, and the other is from a Namco Museum game on PSP. The one from '96 is super solid. Tons of great ideas to innovate on the gameplay while still feeling more like OG Pac-Man than Super or Pac-and-Pal did. Plus, it has two-player co-op, which is always great in Pac-Man. The PSP one is alright. It's still fun to play, but it's slower and easier than '96's arrangement. There's Pac-Man Championship Edition, which was designed by Toru Iwatani, the original creator of Pac-Man, so you know this one's gotta be good. And it is. This was originally an Xbox Live arcade game, and it has a bigger emphasis on time and the score you get in that time, opposed to lives. Lives are still a part of the game, but given the high score focus, you might as well will restart if you lose a single one. Pac-Motos is another strange inclusion. It was just a little extra on the Wii's Namco Museum, and I believe this is the first time we've seen it since. You have to knock enemies off the platform by mindlessly bumping into them. It's not even really a Pac-Man game. Motos is the name of another Namco arcade game from 1985 with the same premise. Not a bad game or anything, but all they really did here was slap a Pac-Man skin on the original gameplay and called it a day. Pac-N-Roll Remix is another game originally from the Wii Namco Museum, although this one's a bit more of a Pac-Man game given it's a spiritual successor to Pac-N-Roll on DS. It's okay. Kind of like a faster, less precise Monkey Ball. Pac-Man 256, which I could have sworn was already on the eShop, but no. It's on smartphones, was later ported to Xbone and PS4, which is the version I have, and is seeing a release on Switch for the first time through this collection. This is a really good Pac-Man game. Up to 4 players co-op firstly, which is a ton of fun, but it's basically an endless runner of Pac-Man, which works a lot better than you would think. There's a ton of different power-ups you can unlock and upgrade, giving the game a great sense of progression. Definitely one of the better games in the collection. Finally, there's Pac-Man Battle Royale, which, I kid you not, is half the reason I bought this collection. If you've gone to an arcade within the last 5 or so years, odds are you've played this game. It's most commonly seen in this tabletop format, although it also exists in this format with pedestals facing a giant LCD screen. Which one does Museum Plus use in the virtual museum? Neither! Instead, they just use the same arcade cabinet model they use for all the other games except with a different texture. Battle Royale was never in a stand-up cabinet like this. It's pretty obvious this was done just because the team was too lazy to just make a new model that represented how the game was actually manufactured. So instead we get this generic looking cabinet that only has one joystick. As for the game itself, it's a 4-player versus game with the objective of eating other Pac-Man. Last player standing wins. I swear, anytime I go to an arcade, this gets played at least once with the group I come with. It's a really cool game. And the only other time it's seen a home release is in the previously mentioned not Plus version of Pac-Man Museum. The version with that abomination. So overall, it's a pretty solid selection of games. The most obvious omission is Mrs. Pac-Man, which wasn't included for legal reasons. Keeping it brief so I don't have to give a mid-review history lesson, Namco was not the creator of Mrs. Pac-Man. It was originally owned by Midway, and is now under ownership of AtGames. Yeah, the guys who make those shitty plug-and-play consoles. There's a great video by a user by the name of Johnny I would absolutely recommend if you're curious about the logistics of the whole thing. I'll have it linked below. Sad twist of fate for AtGames to now be the owners, and Namco is currently in dispute with them over the character, which I assume is why games like Junior Pac-Man also aren't included. This is relevant even outside Miss Pac-Man's omission, because every game here that had an appearance from her has been edited out. That includes Pac-Land, Pac-in-Time, and even Pac-Attack, which literally only referenced her through a background mural. All depictions of Miss Pac-Man have instead been swapped out with a new character made for this game. Mom. Yeah, personally not a fan. Fortunately, as far as I'm aware, that is the only way in which these games have been altered. Each game in the collection has a handful of achievements you can hunt for, all of which reward you with new items for your arcade. Playing games also rewards you with coins. Coins can later be used on this Gashapon machine for Pac-Man figures you can look at, or on the arcade itself via buying new items to customize with. The ways in which you can customize your arcade aren't super in-depth or anything, but it's competent enough for what it needs to be, and it's a nice feature. My only critique as far as customizing your arcade is concerned is that there is only one type of floor you can unlock. There are tons of different walls, but when it comes to the floors, all you get is this solid color with checkered tiles in the corners. I don't... why? That aside, this all sounds pretty great on paper. It's when we take a look at how these games are presented the problem lies. As a forward, let me just mention this game hits you with the Unity logo when you boot it up. Let that just set the stage for everything I'm about to say. A lot of great games have been made in Unity, but it's less promising when you take into consideration that it's Unity handling the emulation of all these games. Let's start small with the screen borders. Many of them are made to resemble the art you would actually see on the cabinet, which is a nice touch. Although there's no way to turn it off and just have the borders be black. For games like the original Pac-Man, it's not a huge deal since not only is it extremely accurate to how the inside of the cabinet actually looked, but the darker border isn't too distracting. But then you got games like Pac and Pal that have a very bright and distracting border. The worst one though has to be Pac-Land. Pac-Land, since when you resize the screen, you end up covering the game's instructions. Why didn't they just have the instructions move to the right depending on the screen scale? It's not like this was even besides the screen on the original cabinet anyways. In fact, to add insult to injury, the original cabinet just had black borders. They don't need to add anything fancy. Just an option to turn the border off is all I'm asking for. If there aren't any border options, then what options does this game have? Well, you're looking at them. This small box of 2 options you're seeing, this is all you get. You can toggle a pretty bad CRT filter, which I'll get back to in a sec, or change the screen size. Not by any discernible scale, mind you. It's all very vague and leads to some really bad screen shimmering that is particularly noticeable on games like Pac-Land. 4 years ago, we got Namco Museum Arcade Pack for Switch, which, while I had a few hangups on that collection itself, it provided an impressive variety of options. Adjustable CRT filter, a convincing one at that, screen scaling that provides the exact numbers so you can make sure you keep an integer scale. Hell, they even let you rotate the screen 90 degrees so you could play on a rotatable monitor to give you a more authentic portrait-oriented gameplay experience. But in Pac-Man Museum Plus, you just get to zoom the screen to 3 vague sizes. And given games like Pac-Land seem to have pixel shimmering on all of them, I don't think any of these sizes are integer scales. And before I lose half my viewers in a "what the f*** are you talking about" state, old video games have low resolutions, right? Games like these are typically shy of 240p. In Pac-Land's case, it's 288 pixels wide by 224 pixels tall. That's tiny as hell on a 1080p screen, so we multiply these numbers by 4, right? That gives us a 4x integer scale, aka every 1 pixel is now 4 by 4 pixels. It gives it a sharp look, no shimmering. Basically, this is what you want. However, you scale that image by anything else, let's say 4.5. This creates problems because you can't exactly have half a pixel. The best you can really do is add some blur so it's not noticeable. But without that, now instead of every pixel being 4x4, they now vary across the screen between 4x4, 4x5, 5x5. Basically, it's a mess. And it's what gives you this gross shimmering effect you're looking at right now. To a lot of people, this might be a who cares thing, but if you're compiling a whole bunch of games, some of which are over 40 years old, this is shit you should really be getting right. Speaking of getting niche things right, holy cow, this is a bad CRT filter. I know a lot of people don't care about this kind of thing. I mean, I generally don't play with these filters on, even on games that get it right. But in this scenario, it seems like it was only included because other collections of old games have these filters. Because anyone who actually cared about this sort of thing would not have implemented this so poorly. So what's wrong with it? Well, just the most important thing when it comes to these filters, it doesn't line up with the pixels. That is the whole point of a filter like this. The reason old TVs look the way they do is because there is noticeable separation between every pixel that can be drawn on the TV. In some of the games like OG Pac-Man, it's halfway convincing because the filter is zoomed out more. Although it's still pretty obvious it's not quite right due to the uneven scaling. But in Pac-Land, it's really bad. Not only are the scan lines not aligned with anything, but they're bigger than the pixels. Compare this to Arcade Pack's filter, which not only correctly lines up with the pixels, but will even scale with them no matter what you zoom it to. You guys got it right 4 years ago. What gives? Every game on here has its own little visual caveats that seem to differ between titles. Pac-Mania has an annoying bilinear filter causing everything to look slightly blurry. Battle Royale has this weird texture warping towards the bottom of the screen but not the top. The game was also originally intended for 720p displays, but is now scaled up to 1080 of zero consideration for that fact. It results in this gross looking graphical noise visible on some of the sprites and text, especially when compared to lines of text within the same game that are rendered in 1080. The colors in Pac-Land are really washed out for some reason. Also, they used the Japanese ROM and overlaid English subtitles on the bottom anytime there's text on the screen, even though this game had a Western release and was fully translated. Why is the Japanese version being used? Not to mention, Pac-in-Time also has very noticeable latency. The only thing worse than a bad game is bad emulation of a bad game. Latency has to be my biggest problem in this entire collection. Every game has it to some degree, and I gotta say, if there's any game where latency can just ruin the whole experience, points, it's Pac-Man. All of the arcade titles from the 80s seem to have the same amount. From my own testing on my 144 GHz monitor, that amount was 6 frames. 6 frames being the best case scenario, mind you, which is pretty bad for old games like this, and can be even worse depending on your display. Due to how cornering works in Pac-Man, there's a bit of lenience given to the player when it comes to reading the input you wanted. Really smart design. And if you ever wonder why the walls are rounded in Pac-Man, that's actually the reason why. But in games like Super Pac-Man, where the maze layout is much more strict, the latency is very noticeable. It almost makes the game unplayable unless you already know the best routes to take before playing. And if other accounts are to be believed, the latency is even worse on Xbone. For reference, this was reviewed on Switch. As far as this version is concerned, and none of this will change my score since these things are not Namco's fault. The two things I noticed on Switch is that the virtual arcade is noticeably choppy, cutting the frame rate in half, which probably can't be seen since I render my videos at 30 frames, and also first-party Switch D-pads are just not good. If you're using Joy-Cons, the problem is even worse since you're either stuck with the infamous Joy-Con analog stick, or these 4 directional buttons. Nintendo Switch controllers are just not that good in general, and are especially bad for games like Pac-Man. When I was playing 4-player, it wasn't even something I brought up. It was something my friends complained about. And when people who don't even analyze games to the same extent I do notice this shit, that's when you know it's not good. It feels weird to say, but at this point in time, Sony has the most suitable controller for 4-directional games. And given the reported lag on Xbox, PS4 might be your best bet if you're planning on picking up this game. Again, this might sound like a bunch of who cares stuff to some people, but if you're the kind of person who is interested in buying the 100th port of Pac-Man, I would imagine this stuff matters to you. I mean, it matters to me, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. As much as I would love to tell you Pac-Man Museum Plus nails it, the quality here is really all over the place. The customizable arcade is a cool idea, and it's clear some effort was put into it, but not enough effort to get an accurate representation of the Battle Royale arcade machine, and also not enough effort to put any sort of thought into how the non-arcade games should be presented. Instead, all the non-arcade games are all on the same cabinet where you scroll through a game list. A game list in general would have been a nice feature. One thing I like about the PS1 Namco museums is that there is a museum you can explore, but the main menu also just has a list of all the games so you can load them up right away. But in Museum Plus, we get this half and half deal that feels messy. Then there's the game selection, which is good, but how said games are represented is another story. Even the marketing. Like, look at this awesome release trailer they did for the game. It's really cool, but I wish some of that budget would have gone towards the game itself. $20 is an exceptionally good deal of a collection of 14 games, and I'm not even sure I'd say it's a bad deal, even taking the problems into consideration. However, I would have been more than willing to pay a higher retail if it meant presenting each of these titles in the best way possible. No latency, no weird visual falters, native 1080p for the modern games, and competent screen options. And also some of the dip switches for the arcade games. Because come on, Namco Museum on the PS1 will let you set difficulty, lives, all the stuff you would be able to set on the actual arcade board. We don't get any in-game options for anything in Museum Plus. And if achievements were the reason we get 0 game options, then just have it so the achievements turn off when you change the game settings. Not a hard solution. In the game's current state, it's not a complete waste for such an attractive price tag. Although I would advise taking the things I mentioned into consideration before pulling the trigger on this collection. I'm giving Pac-Man Museum Plus a 3 out of 5, and a picture of this bunny of sunglasses I found a few seconds ago on Google Images. Hey, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special thanks to patrons such as Allsun Games, Lowy57, Alabium, GamePlayer1500, Kinzel TN, Drew Kellenberger, David Pacheco, Jeffrey P. Long, Victoria Mars, Amanda Guth, Romy Batter, and Abby Knudsen. Again, thanks for watching, and until next time, have a good one.